start?
It's 10 minutes after.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Good evening. We have one more panelist who is finishing up another engagement in the building and will be here shortly, but we thought we'd go ahead and get started, okay? All right. So hello, my name is Dana Canadey. I'm the administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the annual Pulitzer Prize seminar, which again this year features 3 journalists whose important, impactful work epitomizes the best in American journalism. Their work comes at a critical time when celebrating extraordinary journalism is more important than ever. But celebrating the stories and images that move us and bring about change is not enough. Now more than ever, now more than ever, we must also defend this kind of journalism against relentless threats to freedom of the press. The noble profession we believe in, some as Pulitzer winners, some preparing to lead the next generation of news gatherers and storytellers, is worth fighting for. It is not called the Fourth Estate for nothing. Our journalism is a vital part of American democracy, and we must not allow anyone to lead us to believe anything about it is fake. Instead, we must be undeterred in our mission to more forcefully support those who report and disseminate vital information without fear or favor. It is the kind of work that these journalists are about. It's what they do boldly and powerfully and better than just about anybody. You will hear more about their bios and bodies of work in a moment, but I want to welcome all of you, and I want to thank Sara, Eric, and Daniel, who will be joining us soon, for taking the time to be a part of this most important discussion. So I hope you all will be engaged, ask them a lot of terrific questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing much more about the groundbreaking work that each of them produced. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. As you know, I'm Sheila Coronel. I'm Dean of Academic Affairs. I have the pleasure of hosting this seminar. I've been doing this for the last 5 years, I think, and it's always wonderful to be celebrating great work. So what we'll do here, let me just explain to you how we do this. I will present each of the prize-winning work we will be featuring here tonight. I will introduce the work and the authors. I will ask the award winner to answer a few questions, and then open up to questions from you, and then we move on to the next award winner, and so on. At the end of when all 3 have been presented, you will also have a chance to ask more questions. So if I don't get to call you after each award winner was presented, you'll have a chance at the end, I promise. So is that a good deal? So let me also warn you that this is being live streamed, so be careful what you say. So let me start. I've hereby formally opened this year's Pulitzer Prize seminar. The first work I'd like to introduce is the winner of the gold medal. The Pulitzer Gold Medal is awarded every year for public service, and it's a story about something most of you are familiar with already now that you're in the 6th week of your reporting class, the NYPD. In the 1970s, a nuisance abatement law was created to combat the sex industry in Times Square. Nuisance abatement is a policing technique. It allows the police to shut down places or evict people from their homes if they believe these are being used for drugs and other illegal activities. Today, New York City's crime rate is at a historic low. But as Sara Riley, the winner of the 2017 Pulitzer Award for Public Service, has found, the NYPD files more than 1,000 nuisance abasement cases a year, nearly half of them against tenants of public or low-cost housing. In a series of articles for ProPublica and the New York Daily News, Sara reported that the law has been used to kick people out of their homes, even if they haven't been found guilty of any crime. Jamila El Shabazz, who you will find in the photo at the top left, is a 43-year-old mother of 5. She was one such victim. Her family comes from Nigeria, and they are devotees of the Ifa religion. She offers fine white powder, which you'll see there, made of crushed eggshells to the Ifa deity that's also in the photo top right. When police barged into her home, they confiscated large amounts of the powder and said it was cocaine. Jamila and her son spent a week in Rikers and were eventually exonerated, but the NYPD continued to pursue her and 2 of her sons, who had previously been arrested on drug possession charges. The police filed a nuisance abatement case against Jamila, and she would have been kicked out of her apartment had she not reached a settlement with the NYPD. Sara Riley first reported on this practice in 2014 while reading a lawsuit that mentioned the city tried to evict someone based on charges that had already been dismissed. But whether this practice was systemic or an anomaly had never been quantified. Sara was then an editor and reporter for the New York Daily News. She is now with the nonprofit news site Tracer, if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It provides some of the best reporting on guns in America. One of Sara's areas of expertise is broken windows policing. It's a controversial crime-fighting philosophy that says penalizing people for minor crimes like broken windows creates an atmosphere of law and order and helps prevent more serious offenses. Sara knew she needed to show that what had happened to Jamila El-Shabazz and her sons and the many others she interviewed for the story was part of a pattern of police abuse. But she also knew that it could take years and possibly litigation to get the NYPD to release data on nuisance abatement cases. As you know, the NYPD is one of the most secretive police agencies in the country, so Sara had to gather the data herself. She reviewed over 1,000 cases of nuisance abatement actions and found that the police had ousted hundreds of people from their homes and businesses. She found that most of the victims were people of color in some of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Sara scraped index numbers for nuisance abatement cases filed from 2013 to 2014 and put the details about the cases into a spreadsheet. She created multiple databases and cross-referenced the names of those driven out of their homes with the outcomes of the criminal charges against them. She found 173 cases of people who gave up their leases or were banned from homes but were not convicted of any crime, banned from their homes, even if they had not been convicted. 44 of these faced no criminal prosecution at all. One example is Kwan Verdi. You'll see him in these photos. He's a recovering drug addict who pleaded guilty to drug possession after the police turned up a bag of crack during a search of his parents' apartment in Jamaica, Queens. Police claimed Verdi was using his parents' home to sell crack. He insisted he would never sell drugs from his family home, where multiple generations share 4 bedrooms. But in order to protect his family from losing their home, Verdi agreed never to sleep there again. He's now barred from living at home for the rest of his life, and he sleeps at a homeless shelter on the Bowery. Altogether, Sara and her team identified the race of 215 of the 297 people who were barred from their homes in nuisance abatement battles. Only 5 are white. They found that the toll of nuisance abatement actions fell almost exclusively on minorities. 90% of the homes subjected to such actions were in minority communities. The findings shocked even veteran city politicians. Many said they were unaware police were targeting their homes or that the nuisance abatement law granted the police such extraordinary powers. The series prompted immediate reform efforts. 13 bills were passed to add protections for the accused. The state court administrator issued a lengthy notice advising judges on best practices and held training on the law. And the NYPD and the law department immediately began a review of their cases and have since made changes. For uncovering widespread abuse of eviction rules by the police, Sara Riley was awarded the Pulitzer Prize's highest honor, the Public Service Award. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you.
Sarah, this was an amazing piece of work. Can you walk us through, what you needed to do to get this work done? Were you working with a team? Were you doing it largely with yourself? This is a collaboration between ProPublica and the New York Daily News. Can you tell us, how that worked?
Sure. So I did start working on the story, kind of chipping away at it here and there when I had the time. I think in early 2014, and ended up teaming up with ProPublica in mid 2015, because it would have come out in 2016. When I first started on it, I was working as a projects editor and also doing some reporting. And I was working on a project about police misconduct lawsuits with a team of reporters, and just kind of going through the stacks of lawsuits, came across the one that you had mentioned in your introduction, that said it was a wrongful arrest case, and a woman said that the NYPD or the city rather had filed an eviction on her, based on these charges that have been long since dismissed. I think at the outset, even starting out, I knew that I wanted to create some sort of database of cases to show that just to do kind of like a test run to see if I did 100 cases, what percentage of those cases would someone have been evicted from their home based on charges that they were exonerated from in criminal court. In terms of what it ultimately took to put the story together, I do think that one of the strengths of the story is that it involved data analysis, and then of course based on the information that we entered into multiple spreadsheets. The ProPublica, when I teamed up with them, provided 3 researchers that helped me do that manual entry, and it involved going through thousands of pages of legal documents in actually 15 different courts, because each borough in the city has its own court system. So we had to pull records from the Civil Supreme Court, which is where the nuisance abatement actions were filed, but then also from the lower criminal court and the Supreme Criminal Court, because criminal cases could be heard in either one. And only 2 of those courts have all of their records online. So that was certainly very labor intensive. And when I started out, I had my initial question was just whether it was systemic or an anomaly for these civil cases to be based on criminal charges that had been thrown out. But then, as I started, going through the cases and doing some of, reporting, I just noticed all of these other things. I initially wasn't even aware that the law gave the NYPD the authority to, sweep down without notice and serve people with an order that immediately closed down their business or home before they'd even gotten a chance to appear in court to defend themselves. That wasn't something I really learned about until sort of deeper into my reporting. I think that the data entry and the data analysis was a very important component of it, but I also think that the extensive street reporting, field reporting that I did was very important. None of the people that were in the series were people who were passed on to me from a lawyer or an advocate. They were all people that we found by going out into the field and just knocking on doors. Actually, I mapped the cases because we tracked the address, and I geocoded the addresses, and then I just from the map on my phone went to different neighborhoods and knocked on doors. And then I also did a lot of of course interviews with officials and went through historical archives. I think that the history of the law was really important. So yeah, I mean, it was. I think that sort of all of the elements of reporting kind of tied together: the data, the shoe leather reporting, and then sort of the more traditional investigative reporting with the documents and archives. I went to the City Municipal Archive Center and pulled
to get the court cases.
No, I actually looked through the archives, all of the archives about the nuisance abatement law. So I actually pulled the microfiche from the city council records, and looked through records on the law back to the 70s. So,
how much cooperation, in quotes, did you get from the NYPD while doing this story?
Not very much. They did grant me 2-hour-long sit-down interviews. The first interview, I actually, I quantified it at one point. I'd have to look back at the emails. But I think for about 8 months, I followed up with them on that one, sending them emails, calling. Sometimes I would corner people from the press office or the law department at events. And then finally they relented, and they did sit down with me for an hour, and I talked with them about my findings at that point. And it was all on the record, which I think really added to the story. And then I did sort of a second analysis, after partnering with ProPublica, where I had added a bunch of different factors into the database, that we were building. And so for about 5 months there, I had to pass to them for another interview, and they gave me another hour-long interview. But aside from that, they pretty much didn't answer any of my follow-up questions. Even my editor-in-chief at one point even got involved. So
Let's talk about interviewing, because this is something I know our students are grappling with at the moment. You just knocked on people's doors.
yeah.
And then what?
It's funny because I get asked that question a lot. Even when I'm going through the methodology for my data analysis, I find that a lot of times students just want to know how to talk to people. So I have a couple tips that I always give. I used to go door to door for a while as a community organizer, and I actually use a lot of the same techniques that I used back then. Going door to door and talking to people. First and foremost, I always make good eye contact. If you're ever having trouble making eye contact with somebody, whether it be a really intimidating city official or just someone at the door, you can just look right here. And it makes it look like you're giving excellent eye contact. And I just sort of naturally extend my hand and shake people's hands. And I think it just depends on whether it's natural for you, but I think that shaking the hand and making eye contact just sort of makes a personal connection and shows respect. So that's just sort of two things that I always do. I always dress like I'm going to work. I think that's important. A lot of reporters will say that. I like to look professionally, and I think that kind of makes people feel like they're more comfortable opening up to you sometimes. Again, it's what works for you. And then with this case and with this series in particular, I actually, almost everybody that we approached talked to us. I should mention, too, that I had a photographer with me a lot of the time who is fluent in Spanish, which really helped in certain communities like East Harlem and parts of the Bronx. I would not, my Spanish is not very good, so that was really important that he was with me. Edwin Torres is a fantastic photographer. So I had mentioned that I use this free website called Batch Geo, where you can put a spreadsheet into a map. And so basically I had the spreadsheet of all of the cases, including notes on the cases. And I always try and sort of know stuff before I go and talk to people. Everyone has their own technique, but a lot of times I'll sort of try and get people invested in the story that I'm working on, and maybe, drop some, details. So because I had that app, well, it's not an app, but like the spreadsheet sort of on a map, I was able to look at the case details before every door, or every home, or every business that I went up to. It makes it a little bit easier to engage people in conversation when you're asking them sort of specific questions. And I don't ever, some other just sort of tricks is I don't ever ask people, like, will you talk to me? I just start talking to them. And even as they're saying no, I'll just sort of, still sort of approach it like a conversation. And you just find that people will get stuck sometimes with their foot in the door for 20, 30 minutes talking to you. And also, sometimes, when I first start talking, I'll kind of nod my head a little bit, and you find that people will mirror your body language. So I think body language is important, Another thing is I never, if I'm ever feeling like frustrated, I just take a break, because I think that it's really important to feel like people are going to talk to you. And if you sort of have a negative feeling, people can sense that in your demeanor, your eye contact, and they're going to maybe be less likely to be open. So those are my tips for field reporting.
Can you walk us through the first 2 minutes of when you knock on the door and then the door opens? What do you say?
Now I feel like I'm giving like a rap session, or what we used to call it. So I just knock on the door. Hi, are you Jamila? Another thing that always helps is if you kind of like already know the people's names before you go, to the door. So I'll be like, hi, are you Miss Al-Shabazz? Hi, it's nice to meet you. My name's Sara Riley. I'm a reporter with the New York Daily News, a name a lot of people recognize. I'm working on a story right now about the NYPD's use of eviction laws to push people out of their homes, and I've been going through cases, and I came across one that mentioned your house. I can see here, from the records that I looked at, that looks like the NYPD had filed a what's called nuisance abatement action against your home in September 2011. I hope I'm remembering the details correctly. Do you remember that? And they'll be like, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, so I just wanted to hear more about it. It said in the court filings that that the NYPD was claiming that they found these 45 cups of cocaine, but it turned out to be eggshell powder that was actually in the filings. And usually from there, the conversation just goes.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I hope you found that useful. I see people nodding in the audience. One last question before I turn it over to our students. How did the New York Daily News, in this time when news organizations are heavily strapped for resources, how and why did you give you the time to work on this story that took more than a year, or nearly 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I worked on it, sort of chipped away at it for a long time on my own, and then broke off and worked on it exclusively with ProPublica for maybe 7 or 8 months. I think it's actually a good question. It is always tough to get the time and the resources to do a long-term investigation. It definitely didn't just come out of nowhere. I think that's important for aspiring investigative journalists to remember. To sort of keep in mind as you're entering your career. I had done a lot of other projects, some of them much, quicker turnaround, or all of them. I've never done anything that long term before, but much quicker turnaround. Actually, when I started at the Daily News, I was the courts editor. But I wanted to go back to doing investigations, which is what I had been doing before. So initially, when I started doing projects and data projects, I did it mostly on my own time. 11, 12 at night, I would be at the office and just kind of showing them that this is what they actually wanted me to do. They didn't want me on the desk, they wanted me doing investigations. And I think that's really important to remember, because a lot of times, especially just getting out of school, you're not necessarily going to get the job that you want right off the bat. You're going to have to show your employer that they want you in the job that you want to do. And so I was just doing the work that I wanted to do when I had the opportunity. And so eventually I would get a day here, a day there, 2 days here, 5 days there, sometimes a week, but not often, to do, other projects on, broken windows, police killings, turnstile jumping, a lot of stuff that resulted in changes in laws and, got awards and stuff like that. So it was building on top of all of that they then gave me this time. They just trusted me because I'd always came through with what, I said that I was going to do.
All right, your turn to ask questions. Yes, at the back, please. Do we have microphones? Oh, yes, you have a microphone. Oh, there's a microphone. It's you have to come all the way up here so that the live stream can see you, I guess.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
So my question is, you just talked about the incident with Jamila. Well, things went great. She did stand by the door and listen to you. But what happens if someone just shuts the door? What's your plan B?
If it's someone who I really want to talk to, which was the case sometimes, I will come back. There was one place that I went back, I think 3 or 4 times, and finally sort of engaged them in conversation, one of those sort of foot in the door conversations for like 20 or 30 minutes. But at the same time, if someone really doesn't want to participate in the story, and in this case I had a spreadsheet of 1,162 locations that got these nuisance abatement actions. If they really don't want to participate in the story, then I'll just look for people that do want to participate in the story. There were some people that wanted, that were willing to talk to me but didn't want to use their names. But I tended to, gravitate towards or use the people in the story that did allow us to use their names and allowed us to photograph them, and so I think it's a different circumstance. Depends on your circumstances. If it's like one case that you're focusing on where you don't have 1,162, I guess I would say that I would go back several times. I've even written letters and or emails, sort of explaining what I am trying to do, or you can also talk to other people that are involved in that incident. But I also just think it depends on sort of who you're writing about. If it's someone who's sort of been victimized and they really don't want to be part of a news article, then at some point you just have to sort of respect that and, not force them to go through that.
Questions? Yes, please come up to the microphone. Yeah.
To know a little bit about what you do. I assume you did have an event where you went to the door, you got information, you fact-checked it, and then it seemed like maybe there was something not so true. In any case where you had some contradictory or seemingly suspect information, how did you proceed up from that point to the point of, okay, now I know what's true, what's not true?
That did happen a lot, honestly. I think, when you're going to I'm assuming you're specifically talking about, people that I interviewed that had been, so I think one thing just to sort of say at the outset, for me, I personally don't really like criminal justice stories that try and, build a whole issue around a story of one infallible person when it's an issue that affects a lot of people. I think that there weren't any sort of perfect cases in this reporting where you had a family that had never been touched by drugs in any way. If you're talking specifically about the residential cases and not the business cases. But I think that when you have, I like real cases, and even if Jamail al-Shabazz, her 2 sons did have run-ins with the police, but I think that, and I think everybody in the residential piece did have some sort of interaction with drugs, and sometimes those the people didn't tell me that right off the bat, but it was something that I found through records, including actually Jamail al-Shabazz. I had to dig pretty deep. And kind of came up with those records about her son's interactions with the police. But I think that for me gave the story more credibility because I think that people know that situations are complex, but even more importantly, it forced people to ask the sort of essential question of, is this right? Do we want to say that kicking an entire family out of their home is a reasonable penalty for someone who was, found to have a small amount of drugs in their home? Of course, it's not a reasonable penalty. The penalty that they're facing in the civil courts is far more severe than anything that they would face in the criminal courts for that same offense. And obviously, it's not a penalty that people in, wealthier white neighborhoods are facing for those same offenses. And so I think that, it doesn't really, when I come across what some people might think of as mitigating details, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I feel like it just gives the story a little bit more depth, because going into the piece, it wasn't like I only cared about people that were innocent, that were, suffering these penalties. I just felt that it was wrong,
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
You touched upon this a little bit in your previous answer, but I wanted to ask about issues regarding race and culture, because in your story you talk a lot about how this primarily affected people in minority communities, and so figuring out the details regarding their cultural background or practices, and figuring out there's been a lot more discussion about the language, or in terms of sensitivity in how these are described, especially if you're unfamiliar with it. And when you had this many cases, I would really like to hear more about the discussions you had maybe with editors or your researchers about what to include, or what came up even when you were talking with in interviews about how much do you explain when it comes to what are the key details when it came to things like white powder in the apartments?
What do you mean? I'm sorry. It seems like a multi-part question, but in terms of what information did we include in in each sort of vignette about the individual, and how their culture, their ethnicity determined what we included?
Sorry for the confusion.
That's okay.
I mean, so when it comes to a topic that deals with minority communities, sort of like there has been criticism sometimes about when reporters aren't sensitive to how they're portrayed when it comes to crime stories. And your story was very careful in terms of explaining the background, in terms of cultural practice, or in terms of even biographical details. And I want to know if you had discussions with editors, or stories like Unvarnished really had the researchers. Sarah Maslanier had deep discussions about how to talk about cultural practices, or how to avoid stereotypes in the presentation of those narratives.
I have to be honest that we didn't really have conversations like it sounds like what you're describing. I think that Jamail al-Shabazz, the decision to include the sort of narrative about the Yvonne powder was very pertinent, because that was very pertinent to the case, because the case was based on this white powder that they claimed was cocaine, and so that to me seemed important to sort of explain the background of why she was using that powder. I wish I had a better answer for you. I just kind of feel like the way that I framed people in the story was just sort of naturally how I approach my subjects. I don't, I really try not to stereotype people, and I also try not to sort of impart my, I don't know, views on, my story or on other people's stories. I just kind of try and be sort of honest, and I try not to over dramatize things too, which I think is where sometimes people run into problems when they're trying to sort of over dramatize a story. I just prefer to sort of keep it stripped down to sort of the essence of the person that I'm writing about, and just kind of be fair and honest. And I don't know, but we didn't have lengthy debates or anything like that about what to include or what not to include. I mean, yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. We can take more questions about Sarah's story and reporting methods later at the end of the panels. I'd like now to present our second award winner, which is about the opioid epidemic that has devastated local communities all over the country, but nowhere as bad as the depressed towns of West Virginia, the state with the highest rate of prescription opioid overdose deaths in the United States. Drug wholesalers have flooded West Virginia with prescription painkillers, but for years, the exact number of opioids sold there has remained unknown. Concerns grew as the number of overdose deaths skyrocketed. 2 years ago, Eric Ayer, am I pronouncing your name
Yes, that's
correctly?
correct. Yes.
A reporter at the Charleston Gazette-Mail in West Virginia set out to discover what accounted for the flow of opioids into his poor state. Eric has been a State House reporter since 1998 for the Charleston Gazette-Mail, circulation 37,000. He has covered education, health, and business. His work has won several national awards, and his investigative stories have most spotlight issues in rural West Virginia. On the side, Ayer still does an overnight shift with the cops once a month. For this series, Ayer combined shoe leather investigative reporting with innovative storytelling to uncover how drug wholesalers exploit supply chains and he tells the stories of families broken by painkiller addictions. Here is how Eric's story starts. Follow the pills and you'll find the overdose deaths. The trail of painkillers leads to West Virginia's southern coal fields, to places like Kermit, population 392. There, out-of-state drug companies ship nearly 9 million highly addictive and potentially lethal hydrocodone pills for over 2 years to a single pharmacy in the Mingo County town. Rural and poor, Mingo County has the 4th highest prescription opioid death rate of any county in the United States. The trail also weaves through Wyoming County, where shipments of OxyContin have doubled, and the county's overdose death rate leads the nation. One mom-and-pop pharmacy in Oceana received 600 times as many oxycodone pills as the Rite Aid drugstore just 8 blocks away. Eric found that in 6 years, drug wholesalers showered the state with 780 million hydrocodone and oxycodone pills, while 1,728 West Virginians fatally overdosed on those 2 painkillers. The unfettered shipments amounted to 433 pain pills for every man, woman, and child in West Virginia. To do this story, the Gazette-Mail obtained previously confidential drug shipping sales records sent by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration to West Virginia Attorney General Patrick Morrisey. The records disclose the number of pills sold to every pharmacy in the state and the drug company's shipments to all 55 counties in West Virginia between 2007 and 2012. The wholesalers and the lawyers fought to keep the sales numbers secret. They accused the Gazette-Mail of sticking its, quote, intrusive journalistic nose where it didn't belong. Ultimately, the judge sided with the newspaper and unsealed most of the records. This made the Gazette-Mail the first paper in America to obtain confidential prescription opioid sales data for specific distributors and pharmacies. As a result, readers in West Virginia could click on their home counties and see the number of painkillers sold on a per capita basis, as well as the county's overdose death rates. But this is not just a numbers story. It's all about people as well. This is Mary Catherine Mullins. She's the woman on the right, on the big photo over there, who was 50 when she died of an opioid overdose. Mary Catherine became addicted to painkillers after a car accident, and a doctor prescribed OxyContin for her back pain. Doctors just kept prescribing pain pills, her family said, and before long, Mary Catherine was hooked. She lied to cover her addiction, she stole from her brother, she also shot herself in the stomach in an attempt to end her life. She went to dozens of doctors who gladly gave her the prescriptions. In December 2015, Mary Catherine Mullins' hunt for pain pills led her to South Charleston. A doctor there prescribed her OxyContin and an anti-anxiety medication. A pharmacy filled it. 2 days later, she stopped breathing in her bed. Her brother, Nick Mullins, a Madison police officer, responded to the 911 call. He tried chest compressions, but he could not revive his sister. After this story was published, the West Virginia Pharmacy Board voted to enforce a law requiring drug wholesalers to report suspicious drug orders from pharmacies. A southern West Virginia county also filed a lawsuit against the country's largest drug distributor. It cited the Gazette-Mail's findings. Since then, 7 counties and 3 cities have either sued the drug companies or announced plans to sue, an attempt to recover costs caused by the opioid epidemic. 2 big drug distributors settled a lawsuit filed by the state of West Virginia. They promised to pay $36 million, money that will be used for drug treatment programs. For courageous reporting, performed in the face of powerful opposition, to expose the flood of opioids flowing into West Virginia, Erika received the 2017 Pulitzer Prize Award for investigative reporting. Congratulations, Erika.
Thank you. Thank you.
Eric, you faced tremendous opposition while reporting on this story. Who were some of your most powerful opponents, and how did your newspaper respond to them? Were you worried that you would not win this lawsuit, and that the big power of these companies would overcome a 37,000 circulation newspaper?
Yeah, actually at the time I didn't really recognize the size of these companies until kind of late in the game. One of them, the drug distributor McKesson, is on the Fortune 500 is number 5. The other, AmerisourceBergen, is number 12, and Cardinal Health, the other, is number 15. They're bigger than Boeing. They're bigger than Microsoft. They're just these gigantic companies, which I think shows our appetite for prescription drugs, because they don't just deliver opioids; they deliver, blood pressure medicines, that a whole gamut of different medications. So to kind of set the stage, we went to court. There was a lawsuit back in 2012 against the drug distributors filed by the former Attorney General. It was inherited by a new Attorney General. And the first, the lawsuit complaint was kind of generic. It just said, these drugs are causing, massive problems in our state, that kind of thing. There wasn't much detail in it. We found out that the lawsuit, when I was going through the docket, the courthouse docket for the particular lawsuit, that there had been an updated complaint in the lawsuit that was filed under seal. And that was just shocking to me. You had a state with the highest drug overdose death rate in the nation. It's caused all sorts of problems in our state, everything. And it was filed under seal, which we were just really surprised at. So what we did was we filed a motion to intervene in the case, ultimately to try to unseal it. And then to set the stage, we went to this rural courthouse in southern West Virginia, down in the coal fields. And, we show up with 2 lawyers who we were blessed to have them because they were working for free for us. They had about 35 lawyers from these drug companies who weren't working for free. They each had a Charleston counsel, and they had a corporate counsel, and then they had somebody else from New York or DC or Pittsburgh or Columbus. So long story short, we had a lot of back and forth. We had multiple hearings. At the end of the day, the judge sided with us. He was, right in the middle of this, not only handling this lawsuit, but he was in the middle of, seeing people go through his drug court and seeing the issue firsthand. So from there, we got the lawsuit unsealed, and what it had was these snippets of information about shipments from drug distributors to specific pharmacies. Some of them were notorious. They call them pill mill pharmacies because they just churn out tons and tons of prescriptions dispensed. And there'd be like 10,000 oxycodone on a Tuesday, and then the same pharmacy would be like 20,000 on a Wednesday, and then 40,000 hydrocodone on a Friday. And these were numbers that should have been almost 50,000, 60,000 should have been their like yearly amount, but they were their daily, weekly amount. So from there, within that document, we did write a story, and I kind of threw it in at the last minute. That one was kind of thrown in the last minute for the Pulitzer as our third entry. That was back in May 2016. And from there, within that lawsuit, it kept referring to DEA data shows, these pills were shipped there according to DEA data. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Attorney General's office for the documents that they used to show these particular shipments. And that was when we got all of you mentioned the first time apparently in history we had gotten every pill shipped to hydrocodone and oxycodone to every pharmacy, and total number of pills shipped by each distributor to each county.
Would you have been able to do this story if you had not gotten that data?
No, the key was that data. I mean, there are things that are publicly available. There's ARCOS data that the DEA puts out that it's by zip code prefix, and it's but I think like in our state there's like 12 zip code prefixes, and they also list the drug amounts in grams, so it's kind of confusing. No, we had when I got the data, and I had sources that were saying you need to see this, you need to see it, but I really didn't understand what we were going to get. But when we got it, I was just in shock and knew this was something really big. And I try to tell people, I mean, it's kind of anybody in this room who would have been handed what we were handed would probably have won the Pulitzer.
But it's not like it was dropped in your door.
Well, the thing is, actually that story,
yeah.
I mean, it started back in July 2013, so it took a long time to get where we were getting, but once we got what we got, then everything kind of fell into place, and it was, it was numbers that, I think the key was that there was putting a number to the problem, and then also there were numbers that it was the drug distributor's own sales data, so there was no denying it or no refuting it.
This story was not just about data. It was also about people like Catherine Mullins here. How did you approach the families of those who died of drug overdoses?
Well, usually the first thing I try to do is find, in this case, try to find a drug counselor, somebody in a recovery center that can point you to somebody. We'd actually gone down, it was within that same family, but we went down with the intention of doing a profile of another person within that family who had died of a drug overdose. And that's something we learned really quick. These things run in the families. You have mothers and sons and fathers and daughters and brothers and sisters that die. So this was one of those cases where we went down to about one overdose in the family, and then this mother walked in and told us about her daughter, and we went from there.
You worked as a daily reporter, and I was asking Sara about the resources for the Daily News, but the Mail Gazette had even less resources. How'd you pull this off?
Well, I think it was a matter of kind of covering the story for 4 years, and while doing that, writing daily stories. Now I cover the legislature, so 2 months out of the year I'm doing exclusively stories about legislation, and then the rest of the year I kind of cover state government corruption. I have to cover press conferences. I have to do press releases. There's an expectation that you're going to, feed the beast. You got to have, at least one or two stories a day. But I knew this issue, opioids, was such a big issue that I kind of latched onto it, and then I kind of wrote this sort of hundreds of stories. I was writing about, rogue doctors that overprescribe. I was writing about pain clinics that were churning out prescriptions by the millions. Was covering the whole story inside and out, and that's kind of what sort of set the stage to prepare me to write, kind of pull it all together after a couple years.
I'd like to ask our students now to ask a couple of questions. Any questions on the floor? Oh yes, please come over. Careful. And if there are others who want to ask questions, could you come closer to the microphone, please?
Hi.
Hi there.
I had a question. So we read through our program a bit about the opioid crisis, and I'm wondering what's, first of all, because it's become such a nationally covered issue,
Right.
what the media may have gotten wrong at the national stage about this, how to avoid those mistakes, and then the last is just, where is this story going now? What hasn't been covered and what should be covered in the future?
Sure. I don't think much has been done wrong. As a matter of fact, there's been such incredible reporting by so many different people. You probably read the stories, 60 Minutes this last weekend. Lenny Bernstein and Scott Hyman at the Washington Post. They've actually been covering this story for more than a year also, and they've just done tremendous work. I've seen a lot of feature stories that just blow me away. The New Yorker, Margaret Talbot. I don't think you would think, I would think there'd be something, but I really haven't seen anything. There's been a little bit of sort of, what do you call it, the poverty porn, the people outside the state that come in and they want to shoot the pictures of people lying on the ground after an overdose, trying to be revived, that kind of thing. A little bit of exploitation, but nothing huge. What was your other question? The next story, probably the treatment. There's so much money in that, and there's all this infighting between the medication-assisted treatment, the Suboxone, methadone, the Vivitrol. There's a Vivitrol faction. They've all got lobbyists. The faith-based groups. Sheila had talked about the amount of money that they want in the settlement. They're not giving any of that to faith-based groups, which in West Virginia is causing a real ruckus. And they have less, I think, less success than the medication-assisted treatment. But I think there's also a bunch of people are realizing they can make money from this, the treatment. And a lot of the guys that were running the pain clinics are now running the treatment clinics. When I say pain clinics, these are places where you didn't even have like there was a physician, but he wasn't really there, and they'd have, they were churning out prescriptions with machines, like printouts with stamped copies. And so now those guys are all switching over to going into the treatment part because that's where the money is. So I think that's probably the next big story.
Thank you.
The story was really fantastic. I just
Thank
want to say
you.
it was amazing. And I'm wondering, what was the reaction that you got from just the ordinary West Virginians who read it?
Well, surprisingly, I got most of the reaction. There was local people, but there were a lot of people. Our state people have left the state in droves, and I was really surprised at the number of people who are born and raised West Virginia, living someplace else, and saying thanks, for putting a spotlight on this issue. We had the local reaction. We had it was nice to see a lot of people in recovery were praising the article, and that was kind of at not the last minute, but the last couple days. I wrote the story and I was like, this is really darn depressing. And you can't get around that. But I did try to I weaved in this story about this woman who went through recovery and now is counseling other former people who were addicted, and she, one of the positive things that came out of the story was that she later had her sentence, or what do they call that when they?
Muted?
Yeah, she was,
Pardoned.
pardoned. That's right. Sorry, she was pardoned, and that kind of was a good news story. But that was sort of important, I think, and it was kind of a last minute decision to put. It gave people hope, that there was a path out of that.
Hi, you mentioned you looked at New Yorker and Washington Post as some places that had really good coverage on this, and obviously you have some background in West Virginia. But what else did you read? Where else did you look when trying to get a handle on like the scope and just what exactly you would dive into?
Can I just ask them all to ask questions so we can move faster and then one answer? I will remind you what the question. I will remind you what the
I
questions
can't
are.
even remember the word pardoned, and
Yes.
you're going to ask me to do this.
I will remind you. Yes, Marsha.
And my question was if you could walk us through how you approached clinics or pharmacies that you already happen to know were overprescribing or involved in some kind of wrongdoing.
Okay. Yes, Michael.
And were people that were addicted, were they reluctant to talk to you? And how did you overcome that?
Okay. So where else did you go to when you were looking at the reporting that has been done on this topic?
Other reporting. There's been plenty of other reporting. That was the Washington Post. There was another, Eli Saslow, did a great feature as well. It was kind of like after, probably in the last year when I've kind of read most of this stuff, because I was doing it in such little chunks at the time, and there wasn't this. I don't know what there wasn't this like back in 2013. There wasn't this national media presence. It's kind of all come in the last year or so.
How did you approach the overprescribing pharmacies?
Well, in some weird ways, this is going to be hard to believe, but some of these pain clinics, they would actually call us and tell us that they were not bad actors, that they were doing the right thing. Some of the worst ones, some of the ones that had written prescriptions that 60 or more people had overdosed, they'd call us and say, we're just trying to help people who have pain. So they were actually pretty open to talking.
That's great. What about approaching the addicted families?
Again, we didn't, it was weird. We were still writing about pain pills, and of course the situation now in West Virginia and the rest of the country has switched now. It went to heroin, transitioned to heroin, and then to fentanyl now, and carfentanil are the biggest killers now. That's increased like tenfold over the last year. As long as you had sort of an entree with a drug counselor or somebody like that, people want to tell their stories. They want to help others learn from what happened to them.
Thank you, Eric. We will come back. If you have more questions for Eric, we'll come back at the end. I'd now like to introduce our next award winner, Daniel Berehulak, who is a photojournalist based in Mexico City. He is a native of Sydney, Australia. He has visited more than 60 countries, covering history-shaping events, including the Iraq and Afghan wars, the trial of Saddam Hussein, Ebola spread in West Africa, for which he won the 2015 Pulitzer for feature photography. Last year, Daniel went to the Philippines for the New York Times to chronicle the brutal anti-drug campaign led by Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. His images vividly portray the indiscriminate slaughter of drug suspects and the toll on human life exacted by the Philippine government's war on drugs. For over 35 days, Daniel documented 57 homicide victims at 41 crime scenes where drug users and dealers had been murdered by vigilantes emboldened by the president's mandate to, quote-unquote, kill them all. He worked closely with Rica Concepcion, a veteran local journalist and fixer, to interview bystanders and the relatives of victims, go to jails and rehabilitation centers, and to accompany police officers in different neighborhoods. The resulting interactive piece, They Are Slaughtering Us Like Animals, featured both his images and the vivid text, along with interactive video from security cameras and a map. For powerful storytelling, showing the callous disregard for human life in the Philippines, brought about by a government assault on drug dealers and users, Daniel was awarded his second Pulitzer Prize, this one for breaking news photography. Congratulations, Daniel. And I'd like to invite Daniel to come up and show us his photographs. So I think we should have a trigger warning. The photographs can be upsetting.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Sheila. It's an honor to be here tonight, and also an honor to be here on stage with Sara and Eric, such committed and dedicated journalists, which is, I'm sure, one of the main reasons why they're here tonight. This story came about last year. I'd noticed during Rodrigo Duterte's campaigning before he became president that his rhetoric was extremely controversial, linking drug statistics to crime rates, and he believed that he could run this campaign and received a popular vote of over 80%. Within the first month, I was based in Mexico City, been covering a number of different stories over the year. And it was just a story that I'd been, seeing pop up in Facebook feeds, and also seeing photographs, compelling photographs from Filipino colleagues who are out there. Rafi Loma, who's here tonight, and he's speaking tomorrow night during the Filipino conference, and which kind of sparked concern, and it was one of the stories that I pitched to my editor that I was curious to go out and cover. I was on the way to do a rotation in Syria, and I landed in Mexico City on the day and found out that my visa hadn't come through, and I had an email from my editor saying, can you please get to the Philippines as soon as possible. I ended up calling friends in the Philippines, which I'd done previously, sort of to check in on the situation, find out what's happening. In the first month or two, there were an average of 1,000 people a month that had been killed at the hands of the police and extrajudicial killings. So I reached out during those 24 hours as I was kind of like repacking and heading out to Manila to find out what the situation was. And I was alarmed, when they said that, look, this is continuing, it's not going to be stopping, it's actually probably going to get worse. When you set off on a story like this, sometimes you have the ability to prepare for a story, and sometimes you don't. You find out in 24 hours notice. So I was lucky that one of my colleagues set me up with an amazing translator and fixer, Rika Concepcion, who'd had 30 years of experience working in television, and she'd been covering the story from the outset as well. So I landed, and usually when I've worked in different parts of the world, and sometimes you have to, you land and you hit the ground running, and you have to basically from scratch find out what the story is. And when I talk about this, I refer to we a lot, because this isn't just my work. This isn't these photographs I've taken, but they would not have been possible without Rika, without working with other journalists and working with other photographers. So a lot of the times we work together as a group. Most of the killings were happening at night, and I joined a group of dedicated Filipino journalists, group of guys who were that were called the night crawlers. They'd given themselves a name because most of the killings were happening at night. The first night I went out with this group of TV reporters, journalists, and photographers The first crime scene that we came across was on a set of railway tracks, and there was a shootout with police. This is what the police was telling us. There had been a shootout with 3 drug suspects they had been selling, and apparently there was like a 20-minute or so gun battle. There was a group of 30 or 40 journalists that night, I believe, who were out, and TV cameras and reporting. And I noticed something about the bodies. Each one of them was in the same, and I'm sure everyone else noticed as well, they were lying in the same position with a gun next to their hand, almost seemingly kind of like placed. So even from the outset, something didn't look right. About 5 minutes later, we're trying to move around this scene because it's kind of stretched out and covered by police tape, and all of a sudden, everyone cleared out. There was news of another crime scene. And I remember thinking to myself at that point, how are we going to find out? The police is telling us this was a shootout, but how are we going to find out what actually happened if we're like racing from one scene to another? So literally from the outset, I kind of knew that in order to find out, to put all the pieces together of this puzzle, find out who was doing the killings, why they were happening, when they were happening, and get an understanding of how communities were being affected, that we'd have to slow down. You know, we wouldn't be able to like chase every crime scene. And we'd have to go back to many of these crime scenes to interview the families and to find out, you know, not only the police side, but also the side of the people in the neighborhoods who were being affected. So we kind of set off, and, you know, and the unfortunate thing is that with most of these stories and that we came across is they started with the crime scenes. And then we could kind of like pick up the pieces and then go back and investigate and find out what was going on. And that's the only way that we could actually sort of really understand. While we were also doing this, covering the crime scenes, we were also putting in permission to visit rehabilitation centers. We were also putting in requests to go out with the police themselves. We were putting in requests to go to many of the jails as well, which had been overcrowded. There had been a kind of an amnesty that President Duterte kind of offered, which was, you know, if you guys surrender, then you will be exempt from this war on drugs. President Duterte had been very, very vocal and had called for the death of thousands and millions of drug addicts. He himself said that if he had enough bullets and enough time, he'd go and do it himself. Later, when speaking to a group of business leaders, bragged about when he was the mayor of Davao City, which had been for over 20 years, that he himself had gone out and killed people to show his police, if I can do it, so can you. This disturbing rhetoric we ended up seeing night to night. There were an average of 20 or so killings that were happening per day, over 20. And we could only get to a small amount of these because of the location. Manila during the day, the traffic is insane. It's a city of over 4 million people, and it's extremely congested. It can take 3 hours to traverse like 8 miles or 10 miles or so. Most of the killings were happening through the night, so we were able to kind of like traverse through. We would actually start the evenings as well, grouped together for a number of reasons at the Manila District Police Headquarters. Number of journalists had different sources sometimes within the police, within the coroners. We would get information from TV or radio as to where the locations of these crime scenes and where they were happening. So we would, you know, around 7 or 8 o'clock, we'd kind of, as a group, we would go and have dinner sometimes. We'd take turns in getting coffee because most of the time we were working all the way through the night. I was getting back to the hotel room sometimes at 7 a.m., 9 a.m., and then having to follow through and then visit families during the day. So it was quite a taxing assignment, to say in the least. And I mean, I spent only just over a month there, and Rafi, who's here, has been covering it for the whole year, and as have other journalists there as well. We would start off at the police station, and then we would like head through the night and cover the crime scenes, and then follow back up with the families, interviewing them and finding out exactly what was happening. And what we found out was the police were saying that it was self-defense, that the suspects had resisted arrest, non laban, which is the term, and had fired first. Certain reports over the last year, from Reuters, said that over 90% of cases ended up in fatalities. So these suspects were not being arrested, they were literally being systematically killed and targeted. The neighborhoods that were being affected were also the poorest neighborhoods across Manila. This photograph of Jimji crying in anguish and yelling "Papa" at her father's coffin, Jimboy Balasa. Jimboy and his neighbor and friend Alvin, on the 20th of September, were abducted. And a few hours later, the bodies were found underneath the bridge, shot, mutilated. And a week after that, Alon's brother, Danilo, was also had the same fate bestowed upon him, and his body was dragged and he was taken from in front of the house and dumped under a bridge. We, during the time of going back and interviewing, we would also try to get access to show the impact of this war, so-called war. I mean, it really wasn't a war. This was the targeting of suspects. You know, a lot of times there were mistaken identities as well, and the wrong person was killed. But this was a scene that we came across when we were visiting Alvin's family next door, and we had asked permission if we could come back to spend time with them as they showed respect with the wake. These people didn't have enough money to pay for the funeral costs. So what they would do, they would have wakes in front of their houses, and they would have a gambler come in. And people from the neighborhood would come in and, you know, show their respect to family, but also they would be there gambling, and 10% of the winnings would go to the family. So it took this family over 3 weeks to get enough money to raise just to pay the funeral costs. But these are scenes that were happening all across Manila, and actually are still happening across Manila. There are families that are being torn apart. There are, you know, statistics of over 13,000 people that have been killed at the hands of the police, including extrajudicial killings in just over a year now. We were going out with police, and they would have us on certain operations, but when we were there, obviously they weren't taking us on the raids where they were going and killing. This is Edwin Mendoza, who was in front of a 7-Eleven in the evening time, and two gunmen on the back of a motorbike got off and approached and shot him dead. This was happening all over Manila, mostly in the poorest neighborhoods, Tondo and Quezon City, and Navotas. This is a harrowing story of Flo John Cruz, who was home fixing his grandmother's transistor radio when police rushed in and sent the grandmother out. And a few minutes later, Floor John was killed in his living room. The police had claimed that he had resisted arrest, and that was the reason why they had killed Floor John. During that time, there were different types of killings that were happening. There were these official police raids that they said were official. There were also extrajudicial killings that were happening, with bodies being taped up, their faces taped up, their hands behind their backs, and their bodies dumped on the side of the roads with warning signs put around their neck saying, if you continue, then you'll end up dead. This was a scene of having spent time with the Deperine family. Maria couldn't afford the burial of his second son, so she went back to the funeral parlor to beg to bring the cost down. And while she was having the conversation, I was able to kind of get access and get an understanding of what these areas look like. And this was the Overflow Room. So you had the morgue, which was actually the room inside and to the right, which we weren't allowed to photograph and didn't get access. But this was the Overflow Room. And the man with the shirt, there is Danilo. This is an example of the extrajudicial killings. The faces taped up, and these were mainly in around 4 or 5 a.m. in the body that these bodies were being dumped, with the sign around the neck and then the hands behind the back taped up to serve as purpose and a warning for others. This is the first time that I actually had to write a story as well. So I found out about a week in that there wasn't going to be a journalist kind of coming that I was going to be reporting with, and that I would be expected to write something, something about my account, something about. So I kind of went with that in mind. I went and recorded audio, recorded video, and pretty much did the reporting that I would usually do, but actually spent more time going back and interviewing families to find out the full story. And this scene was about 2.5 weeks in, and this is kind of like I'd been collecting all this information, over the first few weeks, and I just didn't know, what would spark off the story and how it would start. And it was so complex, and there was so many things at play. And it was this scene that literally sparked me to sit down and write everything. And it was getting to a scene one night and actually not being there as the police were taking the body away, but being there and walking down this dark alleyway and hearing the screams of Nelly Diaz weeping for her husband Crisostomo. That Crisostomo had been sleeping with 4 of his 9 children in his apartment, and late one night 3 gunmen kicked down the door, one wearing a motorcycle helmet, and shot him dead in front of the kids, and then left laughing. One of them said, "Goodbye, my friend." It was important to find out and interview all of these people, and to do the story justice, and to find out what the true story was, or find out at least the story of how the communities were being affected. We were getting the reports from the police. We actually went and nearly collected close to, there were 43 crime scenes. I think we ended up getting like 36 of the police reports, because some of them were actually difficult to get, to then balance up to find out what the police were stating had happened. And nearly in all cases, the stories were completely different. Erika Fernandez was 17, and her and her boyfriend were shot one of the things we found out, there was an amazing journalist, Patricia Evangelista, who did a story, specific story on this couple, and found out that most likely they were killed by an ex-lover. So during this whole time, there was almost a social breakdown. I mean, if you wanted to get rid of kill a rival or anything, like, this was the time to do it, because a lot of the cases weren't being followed up, and this was one of the main flaws. And this seemingly, there was once again a plaque put around the boyfriend's neck. And Patricia, the journalist, noticed that there was something more emotive in the writing, and she went and interviewed families, but basically found out that most likely it was the ex-lover of Erika's that had killed them both on the street as they were walking home one night after a restaurant. So this drug war, there are so many people that are caught in the crossfire, and innocently killed as well under the pretense of drugs. Thank you. I'll leave it to Sheila.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks. Thank you, guys.
Daniel, you've covered other wars and other drug wars before. You live in Mexico. How is the Philippine drug war different from others you've seen elsewhere?
It was different in the way that usually, it's only recently I've been covering Mexico, but what I'd found was that this was something completely different to anything I'd ever covered. It was literally state-sanctioned campaign of killing on a huge level, and just the ferocity and the speed that it was happening, and with the body count of, at least when I was there, and speaking with Rafi today, there have been ups and downs, but the killings are still continuing, and this is over a year on in, and what is amazing is that there has been a decrease in popularity with the president, but this is something that some of the population actually still do believe that the president is doing a good job, because he's, ridding the communities of, drug dealers, of suspects. The thing is that there is no due process, there is no diligence, none of the cases are being investigated, hardly any of them being investigated, and it's just continuing, and that seems to be like the main.
One question I'd like to ask, because our students here have done or will do stories that are related to bloodletting, and you as a photographer are closer to that than, say, a print journalist. You were doing this for 35 days straight, right?
Yeah.
How are you keeping sane amidst all of that, and then how do you take care of yourself afterwards?
How do I keep saying? That's a really good question. Man, alcohol medication is very, very helpful at times. Having good friends who have gone through similar things and being able to talk about these situations. Having colleagues, working with incredible, dedicated colleagues like Rafi, who's at the back and going to be speaking tomorrow night at the Philippine conference, which is down the end of the hall tomorrow evening. We would get together as groups of journalists on a Saturday night, and we would talk about what we had covered that day, that night, that week, and that is one way of certainly working out everything, because everything we see, it sticks with us, in some way or another. It works its way through our psyche, our bodies, and it was, I get to leave, I cover it for a month, and Rafi and Dondi and Carla and Patricia and like 30, 40 other incredible journalists are there covering it. at different times, day in, day out. And what I focus on is like, look, we get to leave, you know, and it's the families that lives have been affected and changed forever, and the journalists who are also covering it. So I try to keep that in a perspective, and I also, you know, what keeps me going is the feeling of, well, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to be covering these stories. And this was a story that had certainly been reported in the news, but it really, for some reason, you know, with the numbers, with everything happening, and there was compelling work coming out, there were many people who still didn't know about what was happening in the Philippines at times. So, you know, when you come back and you've done, you know, you've pulled an all-nighter to like till 7 a.m., 9 a.m., we're getting breakfast, which is our dinner or whatever, and getting 2-3 hours sleep. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, if I'm not out there are stories that are being that aren't being covered and they aren't being told. Also, when you're there, you never know. I never know how long I'm going to be on assignment, whether I'm going to be pulled out after the first week or the second week or even the third week. And I'm in close contact with my editor while I'm out on assignment as well, and we're trying to work out in terms of my kind of like fatigue levels, which he kind of, at the end of this, about 3.5 or 4 weeks in, he said, okay, there's so much material, we're not going to be able to publish any of it, you need to now write. And I would sit in my hotel room and I was like, just had freeze, a writer's block, and I'm not a writer. I have so much respect for what you guys do. And so I would like trying to be piecing together and putting sense of everything that would come across, and I would still be going out at night, and my editor would call me up the next day and go, oh, so how'd you go with the writing? And I was like, oh, I kind of didn't get around to it because I kind of went out again last night. And he's like, dude, do not go out. I'm ordering you like not to go out. You need to write. So having someone who is conscious also of because you get so involved in the story, and Rafi knows this well, that you there is this compulsion and this responsibility just to keep on going, and you would probably like work ourselves into the ground if we kept on doing that. But one thing a close friend and colleague once told me, Jim Nachtwey, which was that these people have a right to have their story told, and there are so many stories that, you know, go down as a statistic, go down as a police operation. And we'd actually talked about this a lot, as in our role, like, what are we doing? And because 3 weeks in, when you're covering this day in, day out crime scene, I felt so like futile, that the work hadn't been published yet. And it was like, this is still going on and we're powerless. We're not like Superman and we can stop this. But there was this kind of weird sort of connection that, like, you know, the work isn't having any effect now and we're literally just like covering it. And one thing we kind of like talked about was the importance to keep on going, and the importance that regardless of whether the photos are being published or not, if we weren't there as journalists covering this story, we would look back at this time in history 20 years later or 25 years later, and if it was up to the hands of the president and the campaign, they would look back and go like, you know what, they did a great, amazing job. They apprehended these many suspects and these many people who resisted arrest, and they killed them all. And what we're doing is recording the voices of these families that didn't have the opportunity to have their stories told, because it's just so widespread. So we often talked about when we kind of like got bummed out and exhausted, it's like we have to keep on going because we're gathering, in a way, evidence of what is happening and giving the other version.
I'd like to invite those who have questions, either for Daniel or for the other panelists, to please come up the mic while I ask another question of Daniel, which is, your editorial choices, as you said, you had so much material. How did you winnow that down, and what did you decide? How did you decide which were the most powerful pictures to
I
get
think
into
I
that
photographed
package?
over that period of time 25,000 images, and I week to week was filing photos to my editor just so he knew what I had and how we could grow the story and what parts were kind of were missing, in order of getting like a greater understanding of the situation there. So I ended up, I think the wide edit that I sent him was around 800 images, which he then said, okay, I want these 320 captioned, color corrected and everything, and then that's what I sent in. Then based on that, that was whittled down to around 80. And this was done when I went back to Mexico City at the end of the month. I was also editing day to day, so I was getting back from the evenings, 6, 7 a.m., and I was like downloading my cards, and most nights I was like falling asleep with my laptop on my chest halfway through an edit, just to know what I had and what I'd missed and how to grow the story and how to take it forward. So David kind of took over that whole sort of editing process, and on top of that, there were so many people who were brought in during the month that I was there. I was taking down, I was geotagging all of the locations. I didn't know what I would be using the information for. I've used it in the past on assignments in remote Pakistan to find a village again and have returned a year later to follow up with certain families. So I didn't exactly know in what way that we'd be able to use that information, but I was just trying to gather as much data as possible, and we ended up doing an interactive, and also Erika was working hard to get access to CCTV footage that had been taken that had showed contradictory evidence of what the police were saying. So there was a whole group of people at the newspaper, and it took like about a month to publish. And David, my editor, was campaigning hard with the team of graphics, with the team that was doing the translations as well, because it was translated into a number of different languages. Tagalog, Filipino was one of them, and so while he was doing the editing, and I think there were around 22 pictures which made the digital presentation, and then he also had a layout. He was doing the layouts in the newspaper, which ran, I think, the front page and the double spread on the side. So there's a large kind of group of people that were also working on this to maximize the story, but it was my editor that ended up kind of like choosing the final selection. There was some sort of say, but at that point I was so exhausted of like looking at the photographs that I really wanted him to kind of like take over and drive it.
Right. Your question, please.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing the photographs. I was wondering, when you were working with like a really big group of journalists, it sounded like you kind of all went in a pack together. Was that helpful to you? Was it done because it was a little safer that way, or was it more of a hindrance because there's just so many people and they're all trying to get to the same story?
Absolutely, no, it's a good question. Sometimes it was a help, and sometimes it was a hindrance. But most of the times it was help, because we were all there and everyone worked together as a team in a way. Everyone like shared information. That was during the nights, and then during the day we would, as I'm photographing, Rika is interviewing people at the scene, gathering as much information. She was also doing video, so we were able to go back and get quotes from specific families, and then we're going back to the families on our own. So we would break off from the group sometimes during the night, sometimes during the day, and go and find and focus on stories that we thought were important, and interviewing, attending wakes, attending funerals, and then also on top of that having sort of meetings to get access as well. So it was less a safety in numbers thing, because in some way at the start of this, the police were proud of what they were doing. They felt like that they were like showing us the great work that they'd been doing and apprehending and neutralizing was one term that they liked, neutralizing suspects. So, in other stories I've covered, there is that certain safety in numbers, but this was also something that was going on every single day. So there were times, a lot of the guys, some of them worked for newspapers, and they were on shift. So Monday night there'd be a large crowd of people because they'd taken the weekend off. So it was completely varied. Sometimes we turned up to crime scenes and we were the only people that were there. So it was a real mix. Thanks.
I was wondering, along with the people who needed you to report their stories, did you meet with hostility from people that supported what was happening, were glad and resented your being there?
In those communities where this was happening, we didn't have that. It was only in conversations that we'd have with a taxi driver, people outside of our sphere and who were outside of what was going on. Because what was amazing is that a large percent of the population didn't know this was happening in their own town. And with a huge town, a city of 4 million people, if this happens in some of the poorest communities and it's spaced out, the media also, there were times when Rafi worked on day after day for 3 weeks. 3 weeks or so they hadn't published his work. So because for various reasons, there were papers that were pro Duterte, there were papers that were balanced, and some that weren't. So it was really interesting to find out that a lot of people didn't know this was going on. And when, in those communities, people absolutely, we would have a crowd of people who would be like, yeah, and they came, a group of 8 masked men came across the railway tracks and grabbed Jumakio when he was playing with his 13-year-old nephew, Roel. They were playing video games, and they just grabbed him, dragged him down an alleyway, handcuffed him, and then shot him dead, told all the residents, screamed at them to go back into their houses, and then shot him, cold dead in an alleyway, and then claimed that, while he was in handcuffs, he somehow pulled out a gun, and the gun was there, and they miraculously pulled out a small little sachet of shabu, and most of the crime scenes were like cut and paste, like copy and paste, and it was a sick joke, but it was like nearly every scene had a .38 caliber handgun. So we were like, man, it's probably the same handgun that's being just turned over. But once in those communities, people were very vocal because this is a police station which is across the other side of the tracks. These are police officers that they know that are doing this within their communities. There's another story which published, Rico was working on, I think it published a week or 2 weeks ago, that the barangay leaders, the leaders in these communities, are giving lists of people to the police of supposed suspects. And the people that make this list, who knows whether they're users or not users, none of them get a chance to have their voices heard, and then the police or vigilantes or whatever go and execute. So during the day we would hear, you would see the support around town for Duterte, and then when you go to these neighborhoods. So the shift is happening, but it's happening slowly, and early on people were afraid to speak out from these neighborhoods, are really, really afraid to speak out. And now there's a wave, there's a movement, and more people are protesting, more people are reporting on it, and more people have the confidence to speak out, because at the start they were afraid. They were really, really afraid.
You had a question? And I'd like to invite if there are questions for the other panelists, please come up as well. Yes.
Daniel, so you're also photographing the family of the people who were shot, and they were victims and they were in great distress. So have you ever been taken back and say, oh, I can't shoot this, or
yeah,
how do you show respect for the victims of
it happens a lot. for me, working respectfully is the most important thing. If people don't want me there, I won't photograph. So I only photograph in places, I mean, especially intimate moments with Jim G, when we've been there and we've spent time with the families and we build up trust with them. And they know our intentions. They know why we're there. We're there to tell their stories. And, you know, there was, actually not on this assignment, I'm just thinking of, there are times when people say, no, stop. There was one time in Nepal when I was photographing a funeral scene on the side of a mountain and in the epicenter of Barpak. And there was family members there that really didn't understand why we're there and started sort of screaming. And I was there with another colleague, and we very calmly, very quietly got the opportunity to talk with them again. We had permission from the rest of the family. We mentioned to them that if we weren't there taking these photographs, that there is no way that other people in the rest of the world would know about what is happening in their village. And sometimes we have to, you know, like, explain why we're there. And when it comes to, you know, emotional challenges or challenges of covering things like this, there have been so many times that, like, I've been overcome by emotion and I haven't been able to photograph. And I've caught myself during those times after the fact, a few minutes later, and I'm like, look, I'm not a medic. I'm not an NGO worker. And if I'm not doing my job, like, why am I here? You know, so I try to have that in the back of my mind. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not successful, but that's something that you do to kind of like override. And when you're there in the moment, I'm trying to make sense of everything. I'm making sure that my photos are in focus, that the ISO is right, that the shutter speed is correct, and just doing these little things helps me, you know, in a strange way to kind of focus on what's happening there. But something that I keep on reminding myself that if I'm not there and able to report during these times, like, what is my purpose there? You know, and that's something which, you know, sounds great in theory, but, you know, it changes every time and every situation. When you think you're being desensitized, or you think that, you know, you're getting used to it in a way, you get completely bowled over. And you know, there have been so many times and during this story as well that I wasn't able to, like, photograph, and it took me a while to kind of compose myself and to keep on, you know, and have that monologue in the back of my head saying, man, you got to keep on going, you have to keep on, because this is important, you know, showing the effect on these families, it you know, and knowing the story and who they are and how they were affected. This is the way that we're able to reach other people from across the world and hopefully, you know, make them stop, think, and feel something, you know.
You had a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so, hi. I'm gonna change it to Sarah.
Yeah.
So Sarah, they're all fascinating stories, but what I was, with the photographs, it's clear that there's a you know, a boss in charge who doesn't like drug addicts, or pharmaceutical has a profit motive. But I'm doing a little bit of a story right now, and I'm actually a former enforcement agent for the city.
From the civil enforcement unit?
No. Sanitation enforcement.
Oh, okay.
The people that write tickets. So I don't work for them anymore.
Yeah.
They fired me.
Okay.
But my question is ticket quotas,
Mm-hmm.
because if what you're saying is that all top brass at NYPD it's a racist motive, I don't know. I think that it's more of it seems like it is a profit motive in terms of quota,
Mm-hmm.
that they target, and I could tell you absolutely true, that target the low income,
Right.
because they don't fight back.
Right, yeah, I don't think that I explicitly accused the civil enforcement unit attorneys or the NYPD of their motive being, you know, to target people because they're racist. I think that it's, as you said, they target well, there's a couple reasons, but they target, certain areas, where people are less equipped to defend themselves, for the residents. They're not going to bring a case like that against a home on the Upper East Side because they barely stand up in court, and most of the residential tenants, didn't have attorneys. Only 9% actually had legal representation, and it's actually a pretty complex area of law. But I think that one of the things that I tried to show in the piece that specifically focused on the civil enforcement unit, it all sort of ties in with broken windows and broken windows sort of marriage with CompStat, which made broken windows policing very numbers driven. So nuisance abatement wasn't talked about as much as summonses or stop and frisk or marijuana arrest, but Bratton had called it the most powerful civil tool available in broken windows. So what was explained to me is, you have, particular areas that, and sometimes actually, and I think that this was in the business piece, like they aren't necessarily particularly high in crime, but when they go to, CompStat meetings, they'll say, like, well, what are you doing about this issue? And one of the things that they show as a form of proactive policing is that they're, making summonses, they're making stops, they're filing nuisance abatement actions. So, that's sort of one, aspect of it. The attorneys at the civil enforcement unit who I spoke to said that they were under a lot of pressure to meet sort of a certain number of cases a week, even as crime went down. They did have a financial motive because they did receive a lot of overtime, which I reported on, for filing these cases. A lot of times, particularly because they would serve the cases at night, at 11 o'clock at night after work hours, and so that's hundreds of dollars in their pocket every time they serve one of these cases. One of the detectives that filed that brought nuisance abatement cases or pieced together nuisance abatement cases on underage alcohol sales against pretty much like every bodega in East Harlem, then was promoted to detective, sort of demonstrating proactive policing. We didn't talk so much about the business cases, but I think that it's just as important as the residential cases, because a lot of times these are small business owners who have their life savings in their business, and a lot of times they lost the business as a result of the nuisance abatement action. And in that case, a lot of the business owners that we approached did not speak English, and that's where the photographer who I was reporting with, Edwin Torres, was really important, because a lot of those business owners spoke Spanish. So they didn't even though they had businesses tended to have representation. I explained the settlements to a lot of people, and including the ones who had attorneys, through Edwin. Because the attorneys hadn't sort of fully explained to them the various repercussions that they could face for X, Y, and Z, or the full terms of their settlement. So I think that there, is definitely some sort of like preying on people who, are less have less resources to defend themselves in a case like this. A lot of people conflated the nuisance abatement case with a criminal case, and so that had to be teased out, but you can just, if that helps sort of understand just like how, confusing this process is. A lot of people thought that the NYPD's attorney was their court-appointed attorney. They didn't know that they didn't get a court-appointed attorney in civil court. But yeah, I think that in terms of motive, I think that part of the motive that I probably advanced the most was the sort of more numbers-driven, broken windows policing, overtime, type motive. So, but I think it's important to note that they almost are always targeting places that are in Black and Hispanic communities.
Well, thank you, Sara. I think we need to bring this, I know you have an appointment, we need to bring this seminar to a close. Thank you, everyone, for staying to the end of it, and congratulations again to our Pulitzer Prize awardees.
Oh, no, I don't have an appointment.
I thought you had to.